Empathy is, I would say, the ability to put yourself into the shoes of another person, into their situation, to try to understand their point of view, their feelings, and with that understanding, to guide your actions. So it's not just understanding the perspective of the other person, it's trying to also to guide your actions. So what you do is actually guided by that understanding of the other person's feelings, their point of view, even if they're different from your own. If I think empathy is fundamental or an optional, I would say it's absolutely fundamental in language education for a number of reasons. Increasingly, I'd say in the language classroom, in classrooms in general in Spain, they're much more multicultural and multilingual than only 10 years ago. And so we've got this increasingly multicultural, multilingual classroom, which in lots of ways is more challenging for the teacher, but at the same time much more enriching as well. I would say that language education in particular, more so than other subjects, needs a high level of empathy, because in many ways we're asking students to communicate. Most classrooms in Spain nowadays are in some way using a communicative language teaching approach, where the students have to reveal things about themselves and their lives. So and they have to do this in a foreign language, which is very challenging, and students are open up to be vulnerable, and very often students feel embarrassed. Very often students talk about el sentido de ridículo, that they feel silly, ridiculous when they're speaking English, and that can be challenging. So the teacher has to have a high level of empathy to get the students to communicate, and the students that also, I think, have to have a high level of empathy as well in the communicative language classroom, particularly in this scenario where it's much more multicultural, much more multilingual. So the qualities that the teacher needs to be empathetic, it's not easy. It's certainly not easy. It's challenging. One of the things I would say that the language teacher has to be very patient. Again, because we're dealing with communication, but communication in a foreign language. So I'd say the teacher has to be patient to give students the time to, when they ask a question, for the students to actually think, to process it, and to talk, not to interrupt the students, and to have to be very, very patient. I think the teacher also has to be a very good listener, an active listener, and to listen to what the students are saying and what they're not saying. That silences are important as well to interpret that. I think the teacher also has to be, there's an element of kindness as well, actually being kind to the students. And one thing I think that teachers can do a lot is to, with their body language, they can show that they're open to the other students. Also making eye contact with the students, smiling, having open body language, not having their arms closed, having an open body language, just some things like that. So some paralinguistic techniques as well can be very useful for fostering empathy. So when the student comes from outside, so it's a student who's from outside Spain and doesn't speak, yes, I think this is particularly challenging, when we have students who come from cultures which are different from our cultures. The research shows that we find it much easier to empathise with people who are similar to us, and more difficult to empathise with people who are different from us. So one of the things that we can do there is that the teacher can try to find out as much as possible about the culture of the student and how it's similar and different. In lots of ways we'll find out there's lots of similarities, not just differences, how it's similar and different to Spanish culture in this way, and to try to adapt their class to that. And one thing I would say, to try to find out as much as possible about the students, about their lives, about their background, particularly when it's students who are coming from cultures which may be very different to our own culture. The advice that I'm going to give tomorrow in the plenary session to the teachers would be, one thing would be that generally language teachers have a high level of empathy to start with, so this is very good. One of the factors why they've got a high level of empathy could be because all of the teachers in the room will be at least bilingual. They will speak Spanish and English and perhaps other languages as well. Research shows that people who are bilingual, trilingual, polyglots are more empathetic than people who are monolingual, perhaps because they've got an interest in other cultures, in other languages. So we're starting from a positive position where the teachers are already empathetic, but I would say one of the key things I would say that it's important to have what's called a growth mindset, that empathy is not something fixed, it's not something we're just born with, we have it, that we can build it, we can expand it. So we're going to be looking at some techniques that we can use to expand our own empathy as language teachers, and other techniques that we can use to help our students to be more empathetic as well. So I think there is the danger of just saying that only the teacher has to be empathetic, that all the responsibility is on the teacher. The teacher is very important, but I think the students have to be empathetic towards the teacher as well, which is not always the case. And also that we have to try to build the empathy between the students as well, so that we have a positive classroom dynamic. And so I'll be looking at some techniques whereby teachers can expand their own empathy, and techniques, for example, encouraging the students to read literary fiction, or perhaps older students, or for teenagers to read young adult fiction, to read books like The Curious Case of the Dog in the Nighttime, which is about a child with empathy. With autism, or to read a book like The Boy in Striped Pyjamas, about a boy in a concentration camp, to read this young adult fiction about people who are very different from us. So reading books, these types of either literary fiction or young adult fiction, or in the case of younger learners, picture books are very, very good for promoting empathy. So some techniques like this, as getting students to read books, literary fiction, young adult fiction, picture books, also watching films, short films and short videos about people who are different from us, about marginalised people, for example, refugees or immigrants or disabled people, which are not normally shown in English language teaching coursebook. These are sort of taboo subjects, so perhaps watching these films about people who are different from us in some way, marginalised people, immigrants, refugees, disabled people. Yeah, I would say that the role of empathy and socio-emotional intelligence is much greater now. Perhaps because we're living in a society where there is an empathy deficit. Lots and lots of studies in the United States, principally in the United States, show that in the last 30 years there's been a huge decline in empathy levels, and that the biggest decline has been in the last 10, 12 years. There's not so many studies in Europe, but the experts in Europe think that this would be the case. So I think that we're living in a society where people are more isolated. That people are perhaps having more, with the internet, with technology, perhaps people are more isolated because of their using mobile phones, using digital technology and digital media more. Perhaps we don't have so many relationships with our neighbours. More people are living alone, and this obviously has a knock-on effect in education as well. And I would say particularly language education, because, as I mentioned before, that we're teaching communication, and communication is and language is one of the fundamental forms of empathy and fostering empathy.